without any further ado, I'll get going. So thanks very much. And yes, and now you've got me, you'll probably be straining to shut me up again because I've got so much to say. So I hope I don't outstay my welcome. Maybe there'll be a volume two to come. Maybe we can talk some more about other aspects. So yeah, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to talk. I titled tonight the Cairns Orkney, a biography of a Broch and its settlement. And there's really actually a very, very substantial biography that I could detail in a great amount of detail, over 12 phases of activity that we've currently organised the sequence and chronology of the site into. And each of those has got some quite complex changes that occur even within those phases as such. So I could construct an elaborate story that could go on for a long period of time, detailing blow by blow what happens, but I don't quite intend to do that. I really want to focus mainly on the Broch itself, and a little bit of information about the settlement, the extramural complex that goes with it, and then the next few stages after that. So really, I'm dwelling on at least part of the sequence, but not the whole of the sequence of the site. But people often ask us, well, why bother digging another Broch? For that matter, I mean, I'm sure members are aware of the fact that Brochs are almost almost icons of Scottish archaeology, paragons, if you will. I mean, extraordinary buildings, incredible to think of these buildings as prehistoric structures, effectively prehistoric standing buildings. Some of the tallest and best preserved prehistoric architecture in northwest temperate Europe. And they're extraordinary. And there's been so much ink spilled over Brochs over the years by archaeologists in Scotland and from beyond Scotland looking in and thinking about these incredible monumental buildings that you'd be forgiven for thinking that we should know everything that there could be to know about these Brochs. The sad fact of the matter is that that's not really the case at all. And the number of Brochs that have been excavated in the modern era, with the full rigour of modern archaeological science, analysis, and for that matter, modern views on the interpretation of these sites, are vanishingly rare. There's a tiny number of sites excavated in the modern era, and even some of the most astonishing, long-lived, intensive pieces of set-piece excavation, like Old Scatness Broch, pictured here in the middle here, a wonderful set of excavations undertaken in southern Shetland in the 90s and early 2000s, led by Steve Dockrell and Julie Bond at Bradford University. Even that site didn't come into contact with the full suite of early primary occupation deposits and floor materials from inside the Broch interior. That's because there was a whole elaborate sequence of later buildings crowded into the interior of that building. So they never got that opportunity, in other words. And what that means is that there's two or three Brochs that have been excavated in the modern era with those rigours of archaeological science and interpretation. And so there remains an awful lot unsaid and unconsidered when it comes to Brochs, let alone unproven and untested. Our project, as Duncan's alluded to, has been running since 2006, really when I started at UHI as a lecturer. And next year, and this is the reason I have the brackets here, 2006 to 2026, next year, as Duncan says, will be our final field season on site. So that will be 20 years since we began. And it's even longer than that, really, because back in 2003, several years before we ever opened a trench on site, we were doing things like undertaking landscape work, survey work, geophysics, and we were excavating an even earlier Iron Age settlement, much smaller, more modest one, down the slope and closer to the seashore from the Cairns. And you can see that the position of it down in the distance there, in the background of the site. This gives you a view of the site. It's beautiful landscape. Of course, Duncan and Karen can attest to the fact that the sun always shines on the Cairns and in this landscape, surely. And it has an incredible quality to the landscape. It's a beautiful place in the landscape, and you can well appreciate why generation after generation of Iron Age inhabitants chose this prospect and this particular place to live out their lives. Over the time that we've been excavating, over those 20 years, it's been host to hundreds of our own students, generation after generation, year after year, of field school students from UHI, but also students from other institutions and universities, Glasgow University, Cardiff University, many others as well. And so it's been a training excavation, it's a field school, it's got a purpose beyond the research itself, although it is at heart fundamentally a research problem orientated excavation, if you will. But it's nice to reflect on, and again at the end, I'll acknowledge and thank all those people who've contributed over the 20 years to the field project, including Duncan and Karen. Here's where we're at, if you didn't know. The Orkney Archipelago off the North Mainland of Scotland. We're down in South Ronaldsay, down there in the southernmost of the occupied islands in the modern era, at any rate, of Orkney. And we're in the southeast South Ronaldsay, down in this little corner known as Windwick, above Windwick Bay, and a few hundred meters set back from the seashore, as you saw in that opening slide. And we have a really substantial and elaborate set of remains, a classic Orcadian or Northern Highlands, Northern Scottish site, if you will, in the sense that we're really dealing with a complex, deeply stratified, multi-period, multi-phase, elaborate stone-built set of structures and buildings, three-dimensional upstanding survival. You get a view of our Broch there. You know you're doing well when the 3D survival of preserved remains even extends to their roofs in some cases. So this is looking down the passageway of our souterrain that we have on site in the early days of its excavation. And then the picture on the right here is taken more than 10 years ago now. So the site is much, much more extensive in area and also much, much, much deeper in terms of the stratigraphy as well. But nevertheless, it gives that sense of this extensive, complex set of remains. Cairns by name, Cairns by nature. It really is a mass of stonework and rubble and archaeological remains. And we're very lucky to be able to work with this rich, rich site. This plan, well, you're getting two for the price of one here because this is just a sort of outline plan of some of the structures and a tiny bit more detail. But actually, you're getting two for one in the sense that it's also a plan showing where some of the querns from the site have been found. So you can choose to ignore those if you want to, but it's really the background, overarching detail of the structures and features that I'm drawing attention to more than anything. But there we are. And this video, which is not a very dynamic video, as you'll see when I press play, but I still like showing this video because despite the fact that we don't actually take up very dynamic views of the site and move around the site from this drone footage, what you do get is the tiny little figures of humanity, the diggers moving around the site, which illustrates something of the scale of the site itself. So I'll just run it so that you can appreciate that, and you can appreciate the massive thickness of the walls when you see little tiny human figures making their way and scurrying across those. So these massive 5 meter walls, this huge 22-meter external diameter, an 11-meter internal diameter, and wall height surviving above my head in places, and indeed underground structures descending 2 meters below the level of the floors of the Broch, and therefore over 4 meters below the modern ground surface. It's decided it wants to run again. So just a couple more views of the Broch before I delve into a wee bit more detail. And with our geophysics and our test pitting and our excavation, we can show another view of the site. We can show the enclosure works that surround it. It's bivallate on the front of the enclosed area. So you have the Broch slightly eccentric to the encircling enclosure. So like many Broch sites with enclosure works, it's positioned just a bit back from the centre of the enclosed space. There's an elaborate set of remains that are contained inside the enclosed space. And then there's an enclosure system that surrounds the site, ditches, double ditches around the front. And then this linear mark that's running off to the southeast is what we've interpreted as a hollow way, essentially a rutted, deep-set track cut down into the landscape, which we know from the relative stratigraphy of remains contained in test pits that we've excavated in the vicinity and over the top of it, is a buried and concealed trackway contemporary with the Broch enclosure and the village settlement. The village settlement, we've scratched the surface of in a sense, and in terms of its area. And if I show the next shot where I take away the modern field boundaries, I think that probably accentuates even more the relatively, although we're dealing with a large excavation, a large open area excavation, it's about a third of the entire total interior area covered by the enclosure works. So it is a sample excavation nonetheless, even though it's quite extensive. And within that, we've encountered parts of the enclosure system, for example, on the southwestern and northeastern edges, for example. We have contemporary village buildings that go with the Broch, more on those in just a minute. And then an absolute palimpsest of overlying buildings and structures and architecture that have accreted over time, over the generations, over the top of those. And I'll discuss just a few of those in just a minute or two. I'll not milk this dryly for you in terms of going into it in huge amount of detail, but suffice to say, we've had a set of research questions all along, problems that we wish to engage with in our understanding of Iron Age society and of Brochs and associated features. Our questions are things like, what was the societal role of Broch? So quite a broad one there, but that's indicative of just how much we still don't know fully about Brochs. Another one here, were villages and extramural complexes built at the same time that the Brochs were constructed? Because that's a source of active debate within Broch studies and Scottish Iron Age studies as well. Was there a relationship of social difference and power between extramural complexes, the villages, and the Brochs? Because that's also debated, and the consensus has tended in the last few decades to veer towards the idea of the Brochs being central, powerful houses occupied by elite households who are effectively lording it over a series of lesser households that are contained in the village. There's not actually an awful lot of really definitive evidence to suggest one way or the other whether that's true, but simply reading off the architecture and the differences between the architecture of the Brochs and their villages has been enough, as I say, for a consensus to emerge in recent decades. And what we wanted to do is take that back to before that consensus and actually say other ways and means that we can peer into that in a bit more detail and more definitively, more concretely, with some sort of evidential proof, answer that question. And then things like what was the societal role of souterrains and wells? Now, I've deliberately stayed clear of talking too much about souterrains and wells this evening because I could I could go to on about them till the cows come home because they're some of my favourite things of all. So I won't go on about them in huge amount of detail, but that's another aspect of the research. And then the final one here, to what extent can we identify the residues of social, political, and ritual activity or discourse at the Cairns, and do these offer us new insights into the social and cultural life of the Orcadian Iron Age? So, you can judge for yourself to some extent whether we've satisfactorily answered some of these questions or whether we've procured enough material now, 20 years into the project, to have enough material whereby in the post-ex stages of analysing all this material, we may be able to answer some of these questions or at least move the question forward a bit more forward in time. So you'll be able to judge for yourself a little bit as to whether we've quite managed to do that. Just a few key facts. Although it's 20 years that we've been on site, obviously we had COVID years, we had other things going on at different times. We had 2011, we had a pause and caught up in post-ex as we did during the COVID years. So it's 17 seasons of excavation, more than 24 Iron Age buildings that we've excavated either wholly or at least in part to characterise them. very rich site in terms of material culture, so thousands of artifacts, tens of thousands of hand-recovered animal bones, and that's a really important dimension of the site and something I'll come back to in just a minute because it's one of our entry points, we feel, into answering some of those key research questions, in particular things like the relative status of Broch to village households and other areas of the site. So well, we think it's a real key index. That old adage, you are what you eat, how closely connected food and cuisine and what types of food you eat and how much food you eat, so closely tied into identities and to status and potential hierarchies that we see that the animal remains and the plant remains from the site, it has to be said. We see those as really key. And the plant remains, of course, are often coming to us via the environmental samples, the soil samples that we take. And I'd like to say we're incredibly rigorous about our sampling strategy on site. So wherever we encounter building floors and occupation deposits, and particularly so in the case of the Broch, we are 100% recovering all of that soil material, all the occupation detritus, putting them in sample tubs, taking them back to base and processing those samples in a variety of different ways in order to have an almost fingertip like resolution, a fine resolution assessment and analysis of what's going on across the floors and areas of the houses and the buildings and the Broch in particular. So we're lucky to have great finds. Typical ones like these, copper alloy objects like the spiral-headed pin seen in close-up, nice stone tools and stone objects like this decorated spindle whorl, another bronze hoop there, fired clay molds, more on those shortly, so amazing molds for casting bronze jewellery. Lovely bone preservation, which includes not just the tens of thousands of animal bones in the middens, butchered waste and the like, but also, of course, bone artifacts, therefore, as well, like this antler comb, this decorated long handle comb, stone weight there, possibly a loom weight, and lots and lots and lots of pottery and ceramics. So we're very lucky to have a rich, wealthy, finds-rich site in that sense. It includes quite exotic things and unusual things. We've got a substantial quantity of glass beads from the site. This isn't even all of them from the site. So beautiful flashes of colour for the Iron Age, aqua coloured glass toggles and polychromatic, multicoloured green and yellow beads and beautiful blue and white swirling coloured beads and tiny little lovely blue ones, pale blue ones. This one's an actual Roman type. The rest of these shown here are Iron Age types of glass beads, but they're using glass procured through Roman avenues, whereby the Roman glass production itself is almost certainly happening in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC AD, and then Iron Age craftspeople in the north of Scotland, in particular sites like Kilduffel on the outskirts of Inverness, are taking glass, reworking it and making it into lovely shiny Iron Age style glass beads and ornaments and jewellery, and then that's being imported into Atlantic Scotland, into Caithness, Sutherland, and up into the Northern Isles and out across to the Western Isles as well. So lovely flashes of colour that we're seeing from the site in these regards. And then more unusual items. Some of these are unusual because they probably were unusual in the Iron Age, and some of these objects shown here are unusual because of the preservation conditions that we've encountered on site, which give us a whole other dimension into the contemporary Iron Age. And an example of something that was probably just intrinsically unusual is this anthropomorphic representation here. Figurative art, three-dimensional figurative art is vanishingly rare in the Iron Age until you get to the sort of Pictish period when, and of course, the famous Pictish symbol stones, but a little bit earlier than that, from when this little chap or chapess stems, the Cairns character, or Winnick Willie as he's sometimes known, really, really unusual to get depictions of humans or human-like beings from this period, and so exceptional and made of stone. And by rights, if there are more of these things kicking around, then we should probably see more of them in the archaeological record. It's not a bias of preservation and survival. So I think it is genuinely quite exceptional and rare, even for the Iron Age. Whereas this, it's more difficult to say that for this object. Three different depictions of our Cairns cog, that's to say our wooden bowl. Um, the only one the only one of its type known uh, from recovered from an archaeological context. The rest of these across Britain and Ireland, particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland, come from peat bog locations. Um, this is one from our so-called well underneath the floor of the Cairns, Broch. And it's a remarkable thing, absolutely astonishing, beautiful, fully preserved. About 95% of the bowl survived to us, covered in a litany of metal repair rivets. So it clearly was precious in the Iron Age to the extent they wanted to extend its life. We reckon it's between about 80 and 100 years old when it goes into the ground during the Iron Age. So we know that from radiocarbon dating of the deposit it comes from in comparison to the radiocarbon date for the object itself. So it was an object of some antiquity when it was deposited in the silts and water at the base of the well under the Broch. And from similar waterlogged anaerobic conditions and silts on site in that same underground structure, we even recovered human hairs like this knotted one seen under the microscope here. So cut human hair, about 30 odd hair fibers, long hair fibers. So things that are really quite exceptional and give us an added boost and insight into other dimensions that wouldn't normally be preserved on a terrestrial Iron Age site, 40 odd meters above sea level and away from any peat bog or wetland conditions. I mentioned the animal remains, and they are, and I hope to illustrate to you just how important and significant they are, and have been in terms of our ability to interpret some of those major research problems and questions. But just to signal to you yet again what an important resource this is, and probably the single most substantial quantity of any type of object from the site at all has been the huge amount of animal bone, which is really well preserved and so informative, not just about subsistence and about farming and about economics, but the other side of human-animal relationships as well. So the business of depositing carcasses of animals or parts of carcasses, something that I know that Karen actually has, well, she's worked on some of the cairns, um, so-called associated bone groups, these ABGs, these highly structured or strategic deposits of animal bones that appear to be almost votive in nature in terms of their placement. So it gives us all sorts of insights potentially into human-animal relationships and perceptions. And of course, it's closely linked to food, culture, and identity, and status and hierarchy, if such things are steeply marked also. And there's just some of those ABGs, some of the more recent ones. So this is a deer skull and large, extensive antler. And I don't know if you can quite make it out, but there's articulated neck bones as well from the animal in situ there, placed on one of the floors of the Broch, just as that floor was about to be renewed and covered with a new set of floor slabs. And this is often one of the things we see with these ABGs, these strategic deposits of animal bone, is that they're often placed at a moment in time for a building or the household where something's about to change quite substantially. So a floor is going to be renewed. They're going to lay out a new floor, and they lay down these series of animal deposits. And it has to be said also artifact groups as well. And it seems to be something they do. They place these on the ground. They may well be the residues of feasting and celebration that's marked that moment of change that's about to occur, but they're also laid into the contexts that are about to be sealed up. So there's something quite interesting going on there that ties in with one of our key research questions, of course, which is to peer into the ritual and the social and the political lives of the community as well. And on the right here, you just see another the foot, an articulated deer foot after it had been lifted out of the ground, again from the Broch interior, again from a context related to a moment of change, a seminal moment in the life of the household. And here's another one in the process of excavation in this most recent summer, just outside the wall of the Broch, excuse me, a cattle spinal cord column rather, laid out in the ground, still in situ, still articulated in its natural position. So we're very lucky to have been able to move outside the Broch, as it were, to look at this village complex that surrounds the Broch building itself, and to be able, therefore, to compare these sets of animal remains, architectural remains, and artifactual groups that pertain to those village contexts. Most recently, we've been working outside actually the very main front door of the Broch itself and looking at some of those village buildings that are in that region. You can see here, again from last year, a nice view looking out across the Broch, but in the foreground, one of our contemporary village buildings, structured U1, in the foreground here. And just fantastic architectural preservation of this village that I don't think I quite appreciated how well preserved some of the village buildings were in a way that's similar to the quality of the remains of the Broch itself, until we really started to get into grips with these in the last couple of seasons, in particular on site. And so you can see even here, structure UJ, which is over here on the south side of the exterior of the Broch. Things like this, just remarkable preservation. Still, the architecture where we still have the roof over a chamber set in the wall here, and then on the other side of that, a kind of triple decker cupboard. So up on the top deck here, you can see my notebook. That was careless of me to leave that. And a lovely niche here and another one underneath, making a kind of triple decker cupboard. And still with the one of the last things that was placed in that cupboard space, a little cobble here that had been, which is a bifacial hammer grinder, so it's pecked and worked on either end of it, just lying there. The last person to have picked that up was 2,000 years ago, before this building was infilled and sealed forever. So that's how it was left. And so it's almost like Iron Age version of Scarab levels of preservation, where we have fittings, fixtures, cupboards, full suite of architectural features preserved. And that's really important for us in terms of not only do we therefore have the floor deposits, the occupation material, the rich matrices of artifacts and animal bone, but we've also got the three-dimensional architecture to play with on site as well. There's just a little close-up of that cupboard niche for you. It's lovely stuff. And then on the other side of the Broch entrance, but still on this sort of eastern side of the exterior, we've been pushing in ever more in recent years into the buildings that are congregated just immediately outside the doorway of the Broch. And that's structure T on the one hand and structure O on the other hand. And again, we're getting down now, thankfully, since we're due to finish next year, we're getting down into the infrastructure, the architectural underpinning of these buildings. So here you're seeing a drain that's running around the circumference of the Broch at the foot of its wall, and it's tied into a complex array of drains that are emptying out through the village, out the front door of the Broch here, and giving us just absolutely fantastic insight into the preparation work that was undertaken in order to service this Broch and its village complex. And that includes still capped over drains, which you can see there. And of course, all of this is building circumstantial evidence for that key question of whether or not Brochs and the villages are built in the contemporary period. It's one thing to know that villages are there for at least part of the life of Brochs, but some commentators have argued that the villages come to aggregate over time around the Brochs once the individual Brochs are set up. And so what we need to do is be peering into the circumstances by which the Broch and the village were laid out in their initial stages, reading off the relative stratigraphy and relationships between those early stages in either case, and then also radiocarbon dating them and applying any other kind of dating that we can as well to that. And so far, what that seems to be telling us, and therefore answering one of our key research questions, is that at least in the case of the Cairns, our village complex does seem to have been a planned entity that was laid out from the outset in conjunction with the construction of the Broch. And if you think about it, I suppose the reason that's important, imagine, let's just take the Orkney archipelago alone. Across Orkney, there's, depending on the estimates and depending on your definitions, there's between perhaps 80 and 120 brochs. Okay, now that's quite a remarkable, over the relatively short period over which brochs were built, which is just a few of the centuries within the Iron Age, not the whole of the Iron Age, but just a few of the centuries in the middle of the Iron Age. That's a large number of structures and very substantial structures. Each one of them, let's not forget, has between 1,500 to 2,000 tons of stone involved in the construction of them. Okay, so that's a massive feat for an island society. Okay, but if we're adding to the construction effort and the energy that's required to construct those brochs, if we're adding to that the idea that most of those brochs probably also had an attendant planned settlement constructed at the same time, then not only is that an exponentially larger amount of energy and effort that the community of the Orkney archipelago has gone to overall, but it's also indicating a massive sea change in the way in which the landscape is operated, because prior to these Broch villages, there are probably more scattered late Bronze Age and early Iron Age settlements dotted across the landscape, smaller settlements, 2 or 3 houses at most. Suddenly, in the Broch building period, there's a sort of centrifugal force underway that attracts these communities or requires these communities to clump together, aggregate, and build these much more complex village settlements. So that's a much, much more massive change in the landscape that must have involved changes in the way the landscape was organized, the way farming was organized, the relationship between herds and flocks of animals and people, and the way in which farming was conducted in the arable domain as well. And really a massive change in the landscape. So that's why it's kind of important to know that basic archaeological question of whether or not the villages are kind of contemporary with the Brochs or not in terms of their construction. And what we're seeing at the Cairns thus far gives us every indication that there's at least an early phase of planned village that goes around the same time, absolutely around the same time as the Broch itself. So it's quite significant in that regard. And here's some of the good neighbours either side of the wall from each other during the excavation. And this is a feature of Orcadian and Caithnessian Broch villages in particular, is that the village buildings themselves often are semi-detached almost, if you will. You know, what the outside wall of one building is effectively the inside wall of its neighbour, and they share walls and they are integral in that sense. And that's quite fascinating when you consider that in Shetland, the villages which at first sight look superficially similar, so that old Scatness site that I mentioned earlier on has this complex, substantial array of settlement around the Broch itself. But when you analyse it, when you think about it in architectural terms, it's clumps of roundhouses, which sometimes kiss each other, as it were. The walls just about converge on each other, but they are architecturally independent from each other, and that's really quite different from what we see with these really complex integrated village buildings that we have at sites like Gurness in Orkney, the famous Gurness, or Midhow, or if you know your Broch sites like Lingro that was excavated in the 19th century just to the south of Kirkwall, and indeed at the Cairns now. And just to make things more complex and more interesting, and just to sort of take our biography slightly further forward in time, towards the end of one particular stage in the life of the Broch village, it gets added to, and there's change underway. And actually, where we had the ditch previously coming round and arcing around in this part of the site on this northeast side, we have the imposition of new sets of buildings um, in the second, later stages of the Broch occupation, Broch village occupation, and that changes things quite significantly. And so it indicates that that great ditched enclosure that was such a feature of the early episodes of activity at the site, that ditch is filled in more or less quite significantly, really quite early on, and then they're bursting out at the seams beyond the former parameters and perimeter of the site to construct these extra buildings. And of course, this is just a snapshot. This is probably also going on elsewhere around the rest of the circuit of the Broch enclosure if we had access in excavation terms to those areas also. And the Northeast complex is quite interesting. We'll come back to that shortly. From those village areas, we're getting a nice artifact signature and activities, evidence of activities. So here's a rotary quern held by our fines officer on site, Kev. And we're getting down to the levels of doing detailed recording of features that are later than the village buildings. Like this is the corner of our souterrain passage that one of our site supervisors here, Holly, you can see her surveying that in. And next year we'll be able to actually fully remove some of these later overlying structures like our souterrain building and instantly reveal, just add a bit of elbow grease, instantly reveal more of the village complex around the exterior. So there's even now, even as we enter the very final stages of the excavation in summer 2026, we will still see quite a remarkable level of change to our plans, our floor plan and layout of the settlement and the site. Okay, well, let's think about the Broch for a minute. Let's think about its biography, actually, if we drill into its biography for just a few moments. It's a massive, beautiful, monumental structure. There are a few tiny Brochs, it has to be said. They're all pretty big and massive and exert a certain amount of gravitas and impressive status. But our Broch, it is particularly nice. It is particularly satisfying to be able to get into the heart of that Broch and surviving on at least some sites to quite a significant height where we can see classic architectural features of Brochs, like that wall batter that's indicated there. So that lovely tapering masonry that you can see in the wall profile there. It's just beautiful to be able to see these details at the cairns and work out lots of the former heights and extents of some of the buildings from those sorts of clues and features. It's a beautiful building in the sense that it's got one of the most coherent layouts still preserved of any of the Brochs that I think anybody's really encountered. It's got such a clear interior, but it's quite an unusual interior as well. We've been able to quite profusely radiocarbon date it. These are just some of the radiocarbon dates from the site. These are some of the ones that relate directly to the Broch itself. And of course, we've been busy dating all sorts of other features and structures on site, not just the Broch, but certainly we've got the Broch well dated. And what we think we can say with a fair measure of confidence, but we'll build it even more definitively soon, is that we think the Broch was constructed relatively late for an Orkney Broch, probably in the later 1st century BC or early 1st century AD. And then from that point, it runs on to about AD 200. So it's up and running for 200, maybe 300 years, probably tops, which is long enough, but it's not as long as some Brochs have been suggested to endure in other parts of Atlantic Scotland. So Scalloway Broch in Shetland, Neil Sharples, the excavator there, reckoned it had been up and running for about 500 plus years before it was finally mothballed. We are very relieved also to be finally, as of last season, getting to below the lowest archaeological deposits inside the Broch. So we're hit the natural glacial till underneath the lowest of the floor deposits in areas of the Broch, quite significant areas of the Broch, to the extent that I'm actually quite relieved in the sense. It's always mixed feelings when you're approaching the end of a piece of major work like this, I'm sure in any case. but nevertheless, there's a significant amount of relief. So having suggested that we would finish next year, we can genuinely see the light at the end of the tunnel, as it were, and we can feel that we are going to be able to walk away having 100% excavated the occupation deposits in the interior of the Broch. So that's a major source of delight and relief. And it's just a fantastic building laid out in a very complex way that's actually quite different from the majority of classic Brochs and classic Iron Age roundhouses that we encounter in most of the, the back catalogue of previously excavated sites. So in our Broch, we can work out very clear sense of movement, of access, and of occupation of particular spaces. The Broch is essentially split into a series of substantial rooms that radiate around a central fulcrum or the central room, which in the case of the Cairns Broch is nothing much more than a coaxial entrance passageway leading into yet further rooms. And that's quite unusual because in the case of most Brochs, as I say, that central space would normally be taken up with a really quite monumentally large single hearth that would be the single hearth presided over by the household community on that ground floor. That's certainly what we get. That's the impression we get from most previous excavations of Iron Age Brochs. So it's wonderful that we've got this fantastic, very well-preserved set of rooms and access ways, corridors, with which we can work out really quite definitive flow patterns within the movement within the Broch. If we just take for a minute just one room within that set of rooms, the West Room, as its name suggests, on the west side of the Broch, over here in the interior. This is just focusing on the northern half of that West Room. And what we see over time is what we've dubbed a series of cycles, three major cycles of activity that repeat or recur through the life of the Broch. And it starts off in this way, with a central hearth in that West Room indicated in the colour tone there. Paving, heavy, substantial paving in one corner of that space, and smaller, more diminutive paving elsewhere. Incidentally, there's also a really elaborate, substantial ash box one side of the hearth, into which the swept hearth cleanings were deposited temporarily before they themselves were scooped out and placed elsewhere. So that's the initial occupation and activity inside the Broch in this West Room. And what happens next is that all the activity in that West Room generates a whole series of ashy occupation deposits. The hearth itself bursts, the hearth deposit extends out further out. It kind of balloons out from that hearth base stone. And the rest of the floor space, apart from over on the top right corner there, the rest of the floor space is absolutely smothered in the detritus and the occupation material. That's why it looks almost blank here, because there's no stone visible. It's all soily, ashy, dung filled with animal bones, filled with the remains of pottery fragments, glass beads, stone tools, antler waste making material, all sorts of, but mostly food residues from activities around that hearth. So that's the later part of that first cycle. And then after a time, they go again. They put a new hearth slab down. They cover the floor in a new set of slabs, shown here. And they go again. And then yet again, the volume of material generated in those procedures around the hearth, preparing food, cooking food, serving food, consuming it, and other activities, smothers that floor deposit, and they have to go again and build and lay down yet another set of slab floors and a brand new hearth base again. So we're into then a third cycle recurring again. And then that again, that material balloons out beyond that hearth base and starts to cover other slabs. And it's at that point in time where things then are arrested at the end of this third cycle. And then we enter the kind of destruction levels and ultimately the infill, the rubble infill in the interior of the Broch, which engulfs the whole of the interior, not just the West Room. When they fill it in, they backfill it, they've reduced the height of the structure and they fill it in using the rubble obtained from that slighting and reduction of the Broch. So we see this recurrent sequence, and that's fantastic for us because each of these renewals of the floors hasn't swept out everything that went before it and then laid down the new floor. What they've done is they've just set new floors one on top of the other. And so we have this lovely stratigraphic sequence within the Broch, not just in the West Room, but very clearly seen in the West Room. And the range of objects trapped in those matrices and between those floors, beautiful decorated pottery, large volumes of it, a range of different decorative styles, but lots of incise decoration, angular lozenges and zigzags of decoration, applied pellets, lots of decorated rims and so-called neckband wear for obvious reasons, and then dot decoration, dot and chevron decoration, fingernail decorated incised pottery as well. Lots of decorated ceramics in fragments, many, many fragments and sherds from the Broch floor deposits. Things like these, quite elaborate bone mounts. We don't really know what these are. Nobody really knows what these are. They're found quite often from Iron Age sites, but we're finding a particularly large volume of them from the occupation of the Broch. They're perforated objects. Some people suggest they may have been used as edge binding on caskets and wooden boxes or whalebone boxes, etc. So they may be indications of quite complex artifacts that have largely degraded and eroded and decayed away. Here's one with its pins or its pegs still in place, or at least a fragment of one from the southeast rim of the Broch interior from last year's excavations. And I mentioned already these caches of objects, animal remains that are placed in between each of these floors as they're renewing the floor. So I won't go on about it ad nauseum here, but it includes things like these ranges of, these are you're looking at the underside of two querns here before we lifted them. So the working surfaces have been inverted and laid face down. Red deer pelvis over here, a quern rubber stone over there, bundles of coarse stone tools dotted around the place. Just these bundles or caches of objects that could have gone on longer. They weren't a spent force in that sense. They weren't broken. They weren't worn down. They could have been used for longer, but they appear to have been deliberately placed in the interstices between these different floor deposits. Something that's seen across a range of Iron Age sites beyond the Cairns and beyond Atlantic Scotland, even into the Wessex region of the Iron Age of Britain. And just to accentuate the kind of deliberate placement of some quite large chunks of pottery, but placed on edge into the ground, almost pushed in on end, which really signals the fact that these are finishing off one episode in the Broch, because these just wouldn't have survived like that if people had continued to be padding around in the interior. So these clearly were sealed, laid down and sealed immediately before laying the flagstone floors of the next floor down. Otherwise, they'd have been kicked around, scuffed, smashed up, booted about the place, and generally wouldn't preserve in the way that they do to us. So it's clear indications of people very deliberately placing objects almost votively at moments of major change and renewal within the floor, within the Broch interior. Okay, now one of the key things, one of the fascinating things that we can say about that Broch sequence is what I've dubbed here a house divided, because actually, although I illustrated those arrows and that movement earlier on, what it really boils down to, although there's a complex arrangement of multiple rooms, if you look at the colours of the arrows here, in the red here, are rooms that are mutually communicable. You could move apparently relatively freely between these two rooms in the southern part of the Broch interior, south room and the southeast room, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the purple arrows here indicate rooms that also had direct doorway access between them. So the west room, the north room, and the northeast room. Those two suites, those two sets of rooms, the northern suite and the southern suite, the purple suite and the red suite here, they didn't directly communicate with each other. You couldn't move directly through a doorway that led from the one set of rooms in the north to the set of rooms in the south. You had to come to this point here, a fork in the passageway that leads in from the actual entrance passage of the Broch itself. And only at this spot could you make a choice to move forward into the centre of the Broch and access the northern suite of rooms, or left into the southern suite. So they're mutually exclusive of each other. Two sets of binary suites of ground floor access, and in each case, at least one of the rooms in each of those suites of rooms has a major complex of hearths, like the West Room that I mentioned already. So there's a room that takes care of that business in each case. So two major groupings of hearths, the West Room sequence of hearths, and in the southern suite of rooms, that hearth is in the southeast room, where there's an even more complex sequence of hearths through time recurring on the same spot, which shows that was a really intensive area in the southeast room itself. So that's a schematic of it to show how that access boils down. And instead of a big central hearth in the central space, we've got this rather diminutive central room that's just simply acting as a conduit into the north, west, and northeast rooms instead. And that's what I'm getting at here. This is what these classic brochleites more normally look like. So on the left here, the interior of the Boo Roundhouse, and on the right, the early stages of the Iron Age Broch at Howe. And there you see a single hearth, almost indicating, at least in idealized form, the solidarity and unanimity of the household. They all come and congregate around a single hearth. They eat together, they prepare food together, they occupy that space, they socialize together within a relatively large central space inside the Broch, and often there are radial partitions and compartments around the periphery, but you don't have this multitudinous, complex multi-partite arrangement that we see at the Cairns. So there's a question mark over that and what that means, what that's all about. And there's another view of the how, just to sort of accentuate that single hearth state that's often found in classic Broch layouts. One of the interesting things about the Iron Age as well to take on board, just as we go, and I'll not say too much about it, is that what you're looking at here in this slide are agricultural tools from the Late Bronze Age, drawn from sites in the Northern Isles. So sites that yield, some cases, hundreds of these so-called flakestone bars, which are probably mounted like mattocks or adzes and are used to break up the soil for agricultural arable purposes. And similarly, the stone ard points, the early ploughshares, which would have been mounted into wooden ploughs and either dragged by teams of horse or cattle or by human traction itself. Now, as we come into the early Iron Age, these agricultural tools disappear altogether, almost altogether. And it's sometimes suggested that maybe they're being replaced by iron versions. But I can assure you there is no way from the paleopollution signatures that we get in the environment of the Iron Age in Orkney that they're producing anything like a commensurate amount of iron that would go with taking large assemblages of tools like these and replacing them with iron versions. That's just simply, that volume of iron is simply not being produced in Orkney. And what I think is actually going on instead is that they're using these things, scapula shoulder blades, cattle shoulder blades, horse shoulder blades, especially cattle though, and they're handheld tools. They don't seem to have actually been hafted on wooden shafts. And the type of arable agriculture that's practiced in the period of the Brochs in Orkney and in Shetland and elsewhere is a much more intensive, incessant, almost obsessive weeding and cultivation, enhancing the soils, adding nutrients to the soils through midden, ash, dung from the house interiors and yards and paddocks. And they're bringing up the fertility of the soils and the productivity of those soils, and they're producing much more substantial cereal grains, barley grains that are much more nutritious. And the way they're doing that is almost through almost a horticultural-like intensity, much closer relationship with the soil. And this is indicated for us in geophysics with these intense arable infields that surround the Brochs very often in the geophysics, and show us that people are almost gardening at an intensive level in plots immediately surrounding the Brochs. So again, the landscape has concentrated down onto the Brochs, and so has the arable agriculture as well over the Broch period. And we see that at the Cairns through our analysis of the grain sizes through time. So this is a simple plot that's showing through the life of the Broch, the size and the length and the fatness, the width and the length of the barley grains is growing over time over the period of the Broch, precisely because of these enhanced field soils. Until we get to the very end of the Broch. This is the end stage of the Broch here, and it starts to peel off again. It starts to descend, and the grain size gets much smaller. So there's something happening round about AD 200 in our site. And I would argue it's perceptible in the environmental remains at other contemporary sites as well. There's an event occurring, and there's some sort of change underway, which means that they're no longer growing intensively around the arable infields of the Brochs, but actually extensifying their arable agriculture. They're taking on board land that was previously pasture and hill land and unimproved, and they're ploughing it for the first time and much more extensively out. But the quality of that soil isn't as good for growing rich, fat barley grains. And they might be more than compensating for that via the more extensive farm area that they're now ploughing up. But they're getting less bang for their buck, if you will, in that period. So there's a change underway, quite a substantial change underway in the arable side of things at that point in time. And where this is all leading for me actually is just a bit of conjecture for you, a bit of something interesting for you in terms of the potential social structures that we're peering into here. Because one of the things that goes with intensive gardening plots in arable communities around the world, in the non-Western world, and large house spaces and divided house spaces, and with simple agricultural tools that indicate arable activity close in to settlements. One of the features of many of those societies when brought together is that they're matrilineal and matrilocal in terms of postmarital residency. In other words, large groups of women into which men marry into and become parts of these groups of female households, rather than the Western historical model and mode of the women marrying into the male household at postmarital residency. And I think there's a potentially serious argument to be made that in the early and middle Iron Age period in places like Orkney, that there was matrilocality and matrilinearity, and we had been working towards that suggestion when some of the UK genetic evidence started to circumstantially back that up as well. So you may or may not have seen these research papers coming out of Bournemouth University, where they've been looking at Iron Age cemetery populations and seeing matrilineal descent patterns inherent within the relatedness of the individuals in the cemeteries, for example. And they've suggested pervasive matrilocality across parts of Iron Age Britain, including access to Orcadian genetic information as well. So I think we're not far off the mark arguing that there is a kind of matrilineal, matrilocal setup underway in the early and middle Iron Age period on these sites. It's not getting to the old idea that the Picts were matrilineal. It's not I'm not reviving that idea here. I think it's very clearly evident from work undertaken by Gordon Noble and his colleagues at Aberdeen University that early medieval Pictish society, late Iron Age society in large parts of northern Scotland was indeed patrilineal and patrilocal. What I'd simply say is I think there's a big change underway at the end of the period of the Brochs that's moving from one set of social infrastructures perhaps to the other in a relatively rapid period of time. Okie doke. Right, I'll move on. Now, just to return for a moment to the scale of the site, that's those two suites, those two rooms. Actually, when my wife looks at this graphic, when she first saw this graphic, she suggested to me that it actually was closely resembled a well-known animated character. And he even went so far as to suggest that it might even resemble me as well. I don't know what she's talking about. I don't know what she means here. Moving swiftly on. But I think the more serious point is to recognise these two suites of architecture contained in this binary form within the Broch interior. And don't forget, one of the things we've been able to do is recover profuse remains of animal bones from the site. So that's been fantastic and exciting and interesting. Carbonized burnt bone as well as unburnt bone emanating from these floor deposits. Huge amounts of red deer, masses and masses of red deer in particular, which is exciting. From that west room, 54% of all the animal bone obtained from the west room, thousands of bits of animal bone, is red deer. So they're living at large on huge amounts of red deer. And you can see some of the scorched chunks and fragments of that bone there. But look at this, and this is getting towards this business of peering into the differences between Brochs and the villages that go with them. On the left here is the animal bone from inside the Broch in descending order. So you can see across the Broch at large, 44.9%, almost 45% of the bone is deer, then cattle at 34%, then sheep at 12%, and then in descending order, I'm not listing them because their percentage is so small, seal, pig, fish, and whale. Then outside the Broch, a much more classic Iron Age triptych of sheep, 34%, cattle 34%, so two-thirds between the two of them, then pig at 14%, and then in descending order, bird, horse, fish, deer at 2%, seal, cat, otter, and down to marine mammals, whale. So look at the deer percentage across the village, 2% of the animal bone so far recovered, thousands and thousands of animal bone, 2% of that is red deer. Inside the Broch, almost 45% of the animal bone is red deer, almost 54% if you just isolate the west room within that, and then cattle, etc. So a marked difference in the animal species present, or percentages of animal species present, with a particular predominance of red deer and cattle inside the Broch, quite different from the animal food protein profile seen elsewhere in the Broch. Now, and so we can move that, we can isolate to the Broch interior and reflect on the animal species present inside the Broch, and they're marked as well, very, very markedly different. So in that northern western suite, it's all red deer, cattle, and huge amounts of barley. And then the other sorts of things that are in there, pottery, jewellery, glass beads, personal and decorative metalwork, and lots of decorated pottery. In the southern southeastern suite, very different picture. Most of the animal bone is fish, shellfish, seal, marine mammal, whale, sheep, barley, and then the objects are stone and bone tools, querns, hammerstones, grinder stones, that kind of thing. So very different inventories of material and animal bone and artifacts from those two halves of the Broch, a real house divided. Now that would be exciting enough, and it assuredly is, and we'll get more detail and more resolution. Um, but even more excitingly, to take the story further, we're very, very lucky at the Cairns to have fragments of the household itself, as it were. We've got these tiny fragments of human bone, the odd tooth here, hair there, a jawbone just outside the Broch. And these would normally, in the bygone era, not so many years ago, not so many decades ago, these would have been sort of, interesting, but you couldn't do too much with them. And of course, now, through the advent of ancient DNA work and isotopic analysis, we can do an awful lot more with this material, even these tiny fragments of human beings. We can recover almost biographies of these individuals through time and in their lives and get an awful lot more detail. And we've been lucky enough to work with the COMIOS project, which is a big research project, European funded research project that is based in University of York with Ian Armitt, very well-known Iron Age scholar, and the David Reich Institute, the DNA Institute out in the States. And working with them together, we've been able to really go to town on the household of this Broch in a spectacular way. Really exciting, really interesting. And we can recover, you might say, the sort of superficial so what details of being able to know hair color and eye color of individuals and their skin tone. We've been able to recover the biographies of people like this, from her jawbone, so-called the elder, because she was a very elderly woman at time of death. But we get her biography, we get to see her diet through time at the ages of 3, 5, 7, 11, 15, and then much later in life at the time of her death through the incremental analysis of her dental isotopes. And we get to see remarkable things like her diet versus male diet at the site. So here's two individuals for us from the debris period. So individual A is our elder, and here she is grouped with remains from the Broch of animals. And so she sits very firmly close to the marine species. And like the male individual over here, 80% of her diet is barley, but of the 20% that is protein, 20% of the calorific value, it's all marine. She's eating fish and shellfish, marine mammal of one kind or another. Whereas our individual B here, from the Broch interior flow deposits themselves, he's grouping with the terrestrial animals, with the cattle and the deer. So very strong differences here that match to each of those halves of the interior of the Broch in terms of the inventories of animal bone that I mentioned already. So is this circumstantial evidence, or maybe even a wee bit more than circumstantial evidence, to suggest that the business of dividing up that interior of that Broch into two major household groups arranged around the workings and operations of two separate hearths in two separate halves of the interior was organised along gender lines? Are we looking at quite a segregated gender grouping within the household of the Broch here? That's a possibility, perhaps. Right, now I'm going to get to the bit that's kind of an interesting surprise and connection for you. So don't worry, I will finish in just a minute, folks, honestly. But I couldn't resist bringing out some of the genetics here. So this is spectacularly interesting for me, is the far-flung connections that are indicated between our Cairns individuals, the fragments of people that we have at the Cairns, and a series of long distance connections with people elsewhere. So High Pasture Cave, very well known Iron Age, for want of a better word, ritual site on Skye out in the west there, reveals quite close relatedness between our Cairns individuals from the Broch period and that site. And then just as spectacularly to sites in East Lothian at North Berwick, where burials there are shown to be closely related to our Cairns individual. So these are relationships in the Broch period at the Cairns. But actually, there's much later activity at the Cairns as well. So here's another plan again. At this point in time, our Broch is kind of mothballed. We've got our structure E here, and from midden material outside structure E, our classic Pictish 7th century AD building, we've got this masses of midden, and from that midden we also recovered human remains, the remains of a single male individual dating to the 600s, based on associated radiocarbon material. And this is a bit where it gets kind of locally exciting, I hope, for you, because what this indicated was strong family connections to the Rosemarkie man of your parish. So they use a technique called identity by descent. So there's within the modern ancient DNA techniques, which are always developing and changing, one of the newest methods of analyzing DNA is this IBD process, identity by descent, and it allows us to peer into family relationships in a much more reliable and an easier manner. And what they've managed to do is to actually find through the genetic data that's published liberally at large on the back of work that you've undertaken, work that NOSAS has undertaken as part of the Rosemarkie Caves project, this remarkable individual from the later Iron Age, early historic period that you recovered just a few years ago. And I think James in particular had an especially strong connection to this project. It looks like our Cairns individual from the 7th century AD is related to the extent of the third or fourth degree, so something a third or fourth cousin in straightforward contemporary terms. It could be that our Cairns individuals maybe a generation later. So he could be something, actually could be something like a grandson, or even a son of, maybe probably not as strongly connected as that, but maybe a grandson or a great grandson of your Rosmarkie man, is my understanding of what that follows through into in basic genealogical terms. So another remarkable connection for us at this time in the much later post-Broch period at the Cairns. And of course, you'll be aware of the significance, or some of the significance of the Rosmarkie man, where he was a well-fed individual. He had catastrophic end to his life, of course. He had all the markers of a well-fed, well-built individual, which was interpreted as someone with considerable social status. I think you had already done genetic work to the extent that it indicated a connection to Orkney via the well-known West Ness burials on Rousey. Our individual C, our 7th century individual that I'm alluding to here from the Cairns, he also has strong genetic connections to those burials in West Ness, in Rousey and Orkney. So it's hardly surprising in some ways that that these two individuals are indicating almost a triangle of familial relationships with individuals deceased and laid to rest in the West Ness Pictish period burials there on the island of Rousey. So I just thought that you'd be kind of fascinated, I hoped, by that, because I certainly was when this information came to light just a few weeks ago, actually, because this was part of the follow-up work. We knew some of the earlier genetic story a bit earlier in the stage of work that we were doing, but initially the genetics of our 7th century individual had failed, and they had to reset and redo the test to try to get the genetic information, and boy, has it worked. So that's a somewhat exciting outcome for us, which you may well have some questions about, and which we can talk about. And I kind of almost want to finish there, but I just want to comment on that period that later on in the post-Broch period, the site remains of intensive focus of activity. There are later buildings going on over the top. There are major changes underway in society. So effectively, I mean, I could put it in these terms: I'm moving from these roundhouse-based domestic social practices and social formations to the sort of series of sub-rectangular buildings on site, so-called WAGs, that are very like the structures in the North Mainland of Scotland, particularly known in Caithness and Sutherland, these rectilinear buildings. We've been able to radiocarbon date these and see these are significantly earlier than previously thought. So there's a photo of them under excavation. What is a WAG? Well, it's not a wives and girlfriend scenario like this. These are sub-rectangular buildings, as I say, known from Caithness and Sutherland. Our WAGs, what goes attendant with them is a massive upsurge in artifacts and the production of jewellery in particular, masses and masses of high status rings, brooches, pins, and the like, and a huge amount of metalworking going on at that stage. Here's more of the molds for casting some of these sumptuary objects, other tools for the metalworking process, whetstones here, new types of material culture, new types of ceramic. It's at this point in time that we have a massive rise in rotary querns on site and more efficient production, more substantial production of grain. We've got an extensification of arable that I alluded to already. The grain size diminishes, but the area of land taken under the plough extends, becomes more substantial. New types of querns are even more efficient than the original rotaries, like this Type 1C from the early historic late Iron Age period. Gaming equipment and paraphernalia that joins the suites of artifacts at this point in time. Roman-derived vessel glass that's coming onto site for the first time in this period as well, and all the indications of major change underway in the structure of society, centralisation, and if I were a betting man, I'd be pointing the finger at the influence of 400 years of proximity to the Roman Empire and what that does to change and transform and frankly erode the traditions of societies and develop new ones. And I would firmly point the finger at those. It's long since, decades and decades have passed since we were blaming Romans for changes in Iron Age society, including things like the rise of the Brochs. But I do think there's a role to be played in the demise of Brochs and the demise of traditional Iron Age society at the hands of not Roman direct intervention or military intervention, but cultural change brought about by living next to a global superpower, the ancient Roman world itself. So I'll shut up there. I'll just say thanks to a whole number of folk in an elliptical way, and thank you in general for listening. Hope I haven't outstayed my welcome too much. And that's us. And I'll stop at that point.